Welcome back to another Mental Health Monday. I am so excited, as always, for this topic. This week or this month, we'll be talking about boundaries with Cynthia Hernandez, one of our community partners through IVAT. And so without further ado, Cynthia, take us away.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, I'm Cynthia. I'll be presenting today about boundaries. I just want to give a quick shout out to my colleague Lay for helping me make this presentation. So shout out to her. Thank you to her. But yeah, let's get into it. So first, First, I want to talk about what are boundaries, right? What is the purpose of having boundaries? So boundaries are defined as limits. You can think of it as a line, a limit, an edge that clearly separates or defines you from others. If we're thinking about it from a literal sense, you can think about it like a door or a wall that separates you from one room to the other. But when we think about it from a more figurative sense or how you might present it, you might have boundaries within your workplace or at home or with your family, with your friends, with strangers, with acquaintances. You can have it in any interpersonal relationship that you have. And usually boundaries are used to help define what behaviors are acceptable for an individual. So what behaviors are you willing to accept? Boundaries are needed in order to create a healthy sense of personal space between either your workplace and your personal life or different areas of your personal life. So for example, within the workplace and your personal life, you might have a boundary of not responding to work emails before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. during the week and not during the weekends at all. And you might have different boundaries within your personal life, like between you and your friends or between you and your family. Now, knowing what your boundaries are important because it allows you to say no without feeling guilty, right? A lot of the times we might feel guilty or shameful for saying no to someone for a certain reason, but these boundaries provide you with a sort of guideline or a rule of when you can say no, again, without feeling guilty. So I want to talk a little bit about what different types of boundaries there are. So there's 6 main types of boundaries, which include physical boundaries, intellectual boundaries, emotional boundaries, sexual boundaries, material boundaries, and time boundaries. And then we have these non-negotiables or these hard boundaries, these deal breakers. And non-negotiable boundaries can fall within any of these other 6 categories. So you can have a non-negotiable that's related to a physical boundary, or maybe a non-negotiable or a deal breaker has to do with your emotional boundary. But we'll get into more detail about what each of these boundaries are, maybe different examples and how they might play out in your life. So a physical boundary. These are any boundaries that have to do with your level of comfort in terms of how others interact with your physical body or how you might want to protect your physical space. So think of it as a personal space bubble. So if you're thinking of like one of those hamster balls, that's like your personal space bubble. A physical boundary that was pretty common in the last 3 years, right, during COVID, was not shaking hands with other people, right? That is an example of a physical boundary that we put in place, that most people put in place. Another example of a physical boundary during that time was the social distancing rule of 6 feet apart, right? That's another example of a physical boundary that most people put in place throughout the last 3 years. Another example is not wanting to be hugged by someone you're uncomfortable with. We're seeing this a lot as we're allowing kids to be a little bit more autonomous, right? Allowing kids to not hug everyone at a family party if they're not comfortable doing so. That's an example of allowing a child to have the autonomy to place a physical boundary with others. Now, in terms of intellectual boundaries, these are boundaries that we put in place in relation to one's own thoughts and beliefs or opinions, right? It might be that we have to think about respecting different opinions or having an open dialogue with others. If we're thinking about this, an example of this is maybe telling someone, I'd love to talk about this more with you, but I don't think that talking about it during dinner time is the most appropriate or the best time to do so. Maybe you have a colleague who has a tendency of talking down to you when they're talking with you, especially when you have a disagreement on something. So a way to establish a boundary there is saying, I know that we disagree, but I won't let you belittle me like that, right? That's an example of placing an intellectual boundary. Something that I think is interesting is that I feel like intellectual boundaries and emotional boundaries tend to overlap sometimes. especially because our emotions or our feelings tend to overlap with our own thoughts or opinions. However, there is a difference, right? So again, intellectual boundaries focus on your thoughts, your beliefs, your opinions, and emotional boundaries focus more on our feelings. So speaking of emotional boundaries, emotional boundaries have to do with a person's feelings, the boundaries that we put up to protect our own feelings. So for example, you might not feel comfortable sharing everything with your friend or a partner or a stranger or an acquaintance right away, right? You might feel more comfortable sharing things gradually over time. So let's say that you're having your first conversation or your first meeting with a potential partner or a potential friend. You might let them know that I don't feel comfortable talking about X, Y, and Z. Maybe there might be a situation where you're fighting with someone, right? Fighting maybe with a friend, and they're texting you while you're at work, asking you, how you're feeling. You might want to set a boundary and say, I don't want to talk about X, Y, and Z while at work because I need to focus. So again, that's setting a boundary in terms of your emotional expression. Now, I think what's important is that this shouldn't be too harsh of a boundary where you're keeping people completely away from you, right? This doesn't mean that you're never going to share an emotion with them or talk to them about how you're feeling. It's just a matter of when that will happen, right? It's over time. Another boundary is sexual boundaries. So these are the boundaries and expectations that we have concerning intimacy. What I think is important is that these boundaries can be put in place with people that you're actually intimate with and with people that you're not intimate with at all, right? So when it comes to people that you're intimate with, right, or a partner, a sexual boundary that might come into place might have to do with the use of contraception, right? You might have a boundary of every single time that we're intimate, we're going to use contraception, right? Or a common boundary that should be in place is the idea of verbal, enthusiastic, and ongoing consent, right? That's an example of a sexual boundary that might be put into place. Now, with people who you're not intimate with, these are like your friends, your coworkers, your family, the people around you, and the comments that they might be making around you, or the way that they're putting their hands on you or touching you, right? Things that you might not be comfortable with. And so let's say you have a colleague who feels comfortable making inappropriate comments or sexual comments around you. A way to make a boundary is to say, I don't feel comfortable with you making those types of comments around me or about me, right? Especially when it has to do with sexual comments. Another boundary that you can put into place is related to material boundaries. So these are boundaries that have to do with protecting your material or personal belongings. So this might be if you're lending a friend or a family member one of your belongings, like a book or a dress. Maybe you're letting your sister borrow your car for the evening. Maybe you're letting someone, like a friend, borrow money. So a way to establish a material boundary is to ask them to take care of what it is that you're lending them, right? If it has to do with a book, maybe telling them not to ruin the pages, or don't write on the pages, don't dog ear the pages or tear the pages, right? That's an example of a material boundary. Maybe it has to do with just putting things back where they found them, right? Oh, your sister's borrowing your charger. Okay, yeah, you can borrow it. Just please put it back when you're done using it. If it has to do with your car, if someone's using your car, maybe asking them to fill up the tank to where you left it once they're done using it. As I said, it could also be related to finances. So let's say your coworkers are constantly going out to lunch, inviting you to lunch, and you feel obligated to attend or to go and buy your lunch. However, maybe you're struggling financially or just want to put yourself on a budget financially. You can let them know and place a boundary saying, I'm on a budget, so I won't order food today. Again, that's an example of putting a material boundary for yourself. So now going into time boundaries, this is actually one that I like to establish within my personal life. So protecting the use and misuse of your time. So for me, this is like with my friends and with my family, right? So if someone is constantly late with your meetings, you might want to put a boundary in place, like letting them know, I really appreciate it if you could arrive on time to our meetings, or maybe I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know when you're going to be late. That way you're not waiting for them or worried about them because you don't know what's going on. So again, that's an example of a time boundary. Another example is like what I talked about in the beginning is if you're maybe receiving work emails really late. right? Maybe letting your coworker or your boss know, I reserve my evenings for family time, so I won't be responding to those emails until the morning. Another time boundary that you can put into place is if you're prioritizing maybe work or school over like fun time, right? Or family time or friend time. So let's say you have a project due at the end of the day, right? And your family friend decides to have a dinner party and they're inviting you over. You might have to decline that invitation in order to prioritize your time wisely, right? Or you might set a limit to how long you're going to be at that event, right? Maybe telling them, yeah, I'll go, but I can only stay for an hour, right? That's an example of setting a time boundary. So now going into the non-negotiables, right? The hard boundaries, the deal breakers. As I mentioned, this can fall under any of the other categories that we already talked about. So these are the things that you absolutely must have in order to feel safe. It usually pertains to safety issues like physical violence, emotional violence, drug or alcohol use, fidelity issues, or life-threatening health issues. So if you're in a relationship with someone, a hard boundary that you might have is saying that I'm not going to stay with someone who, abuses alcohol or drugs, or who is physically or emotionally abusive, or who has difficulties with fidelity or trust, right? So those might be deal breakers. And if someone is constantly crossing that boundary, you might have to rethink that relationship, right? If it's a deal breaker, that might mean that that relationship ends, or maybe you have to reevaluate how often you spend time with that person. So the next thing I want to talk about is unhealthy boundaries, right? Sometimes we might not know if the boundary that we're establishing is a healthy one, right? And unhealthy boundaries often tend to be either too rigid or too porous, right? It's either too hard of a boundary or it's too loose of a boundary. And so healthy boundaries tend to fall somewhere in between those two extremes. So rigid boundaries are those boundaries that keep other people at a distance, even loved ones. So maybe you refuse to talk about your emotions with your partner, or you hardly ever set a time to meet with your friends. So these are the boundaries that don't really allow you to have much of a healthy relationship with other people. And I think that's really important to emphasize, is that boundaries are meant to create healthier relationships. Now, porous or weak boundaries, they usually develop when you have a hard time saying no to other people. So this might be if someone were to call you a pushover, right? Or if someone were to say that you tend to let other people walk all over you. This is because you might have porous or weak boundaries. So for example, you might be too willing to take on all the responsibilities in a relationship or at work, or, with your family, things like that. Or maybe you tend to overshare when talking with strangers. So you're not really having much of any type of boundary with people, right? And so why do people establish these unhealthy boundaries, right? There's a lot of different reasons why people might constantly struggle with establishing healthy boundaries and instead are establishing unhealthy boundaries. So one example, or one reason why someone might establish an unhealthy boundary is this desire for control. So some people use boundaries as a way to manipulate others. For example, they might use rigid boundaries to stonewall conversations and refuse to engage with you until you do what you want. So, or what they want, sorry. So maybe saying something like, oh, I'm not going to speak to you until you do X, Y, and Z, right? And that's not a way of establishing a boundary. Instead, that's a way to try to gain power and control over someone else. Another reason why someone might consistently establish unhealthy boundaries is because of a fear of rejection. So if you're afraid that a romantic partner or a friend might walk out of your life because of your flaws, you might hesitate to be emotionally open with them. So now you're establishing a rigid boundary, right? You're not opening up to them. You're not allowing yourself to have a healthy relationship with them. Another way that fear of rejection can come into play with boundaries, with unhealthy boundaries, is that if you're afraid that they might walk out of your life, you might not establish strong enough boundaries, right? And so they're too porous, they're too weak. And so again, this is when people can take advantage of you, or walk all over you. Another reason is that people might lack the experience with setting limitations, appropriate limitations. So let's say if you grew up surrounded by people who set poor personal boundaries, managing healthy, proper ones can be really difficult. And so you might think that invading someone's private or privacy and personal space is normal because your parents and siblings did it to you. right? And so if you have that experience, it might be really difficult to set healthy boundaries with other people. In addition, if you have a more overly agreeable personality, you might be too eager to please other people. You might allow them to do the things that might make you feel uncomfortable, right? Again, not establishing stronger boundaries. And so maybe you're regularly overcommitting to activities or agree to help with people, even though you don't really want to, mainly because you want to feel loved or accepted or needed or wanted. And so again, you're not establishing strong enough boundaries to really have a healthy relationship with another person. Another example is low self-esteem. So you might feel as if your needs and your wants are not worth vocalizing or not as important as other people's needs and wants. And so you instead prioritize what other people might want, and instead you're continuing to be uncomfortable in these relationships. So those are some reasons why someone might continue to establish unhealthy boundaries within their relationships. So now that we've talked a little bit about healthy and unhealthy boundaries, I want to talk about how to establish and maintain healthy boundaries, right? How do we go from not really establishing boundaries in our life to now trying to establish boundaries with and limitations with the people in our life, right? The first step is to really recognize that you do deserve to be treated with respect, right? As we talked about in the last slide, for someone who has low self-esteem, they may not think that they deserve respect or to be treated with respect or to be treated with the same level of respect as other people in their life. And so they might not be able to establish a healthy, strong boundary. And so once you're able to recognize and accept that you deserve respect, then you can move on to really understanding what your limitations are. So that's the next step, is being aware of what your limits are, right? As I talked about for myself, time boundaries are really important for my personal relationships, right? So for someone else, it might be physical boundaries that are really important, or maybe material boundaries are what's really important to them, or maybe it's the emotional boundaries that are most important to them. So you really need to identify and prioritize what's most important to you in terms of those limits. And maybe what's most important is to identify what your non-negotiables are, your hard limits. Or maybe it's more important to really establish those soft limits first, right? Those things that may not be non-negotiables, but are still really important to establishing a healthy relationship with people. Once you're aware of what your limits are, the most important next step, or I guess maybe the second most important, because I do think recognizing that you deserve to be treated with respect is most important. So the next most important step is to communicate and express what your limitations are with these relationships, right? This is important, especially when it comes to establishing new boundaries in an old relationship, right? Maybe you have a friend that you've been friends with for like 10, 15 years, but you never really had these boundaries put in place. And now you're thinking, I should put these boundaries in place. It might be difficult for them to be able to know that that's exactly what you want right now, right? So you have to communicate with that, express that to them. And what's important too is understanding that now that you've expressed these limits, you need to be able to say no to certain things, right? Like the dinner party that I discussed earlier. You might have to say no to certain things in order to continue to establish your boundaries. You also need to be able to accept when someone else says no. Now, there's two different ways that that might play out. One, someone saying no to you because they're establishing their own boundaries, right? Maybe they're declining your invitation to a dinner party because they have a project to work on, right? So maybe they're establishing their own boundaries. So learning to accept that other people can say no to you and establish boundaries with you as well. Another way that someone can say no to you is if they're maybe denying your boundary, right? And what does that look like for you? If they're crossing a hard boundary, a non-negotiable, does that mean that suddenly that relationship ends, right? That is a decision for you to come to. Or maybe that means that you have to reevaluate what that relationship looks like I discussed earlier. Or maybe that just means that you have to reevaluate how this boundary plays out. So again, being able to communicate and express these boundaries. After that, it's important to be consistent and firm. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide about reasserting your boundaries, but that's something that you have to continue to do with your relationships. Most importantly, you have to be consistent with your boundaries, right? Other people aren't going to be able to learn about these boundaries unless you're consistent and firm with them, right? if you establish a boundary and then you kind of waver on it, or you're kind of flimsy with the boundary, then that makes it a weak or too porous boundary, right? And we don't want that. We want a strong boundary that isn't too rigid, but also isn't too weak, right? So now that we've learned how to establish and maintain boundaries, it's important to know what to expect when you're establishing boundaries, right? The ideal situation is that you establish this boundary, right? You communicate with your friend or your family or your boss or your partner what these boundaries are, and they decide, yes, okay, great, we'll continue to establish this boundary. I'm listening. Let's move forward with that boundary in place, right? That's the complete ideal situation. However, that's not always the case, right? Sometimes we're going to be met with pushback, with anger, with resistance, with criticism. And that's usually one of the reasons why we're so reluctant to set these boundaries, right? We might be scared of having that tension within these relationships. We don't necessarily always want that type of confrontation. But it's important to remember that it's not wrong or mean to set these boundaries, right? We're not setting these boundaries as a way to punish our friends or our family or to try to control them. We're setting them as a way to protect and help our own well-being while also creating healthier relationships with them, right? When we don't set these boundaries, we often become really resentful or angry, which is not good for any of our relationships, right? So let me give you an example. Like we talked about before, if your boss is emailing you after work, right, and you're constantly responding back to them, you might grow resentful because you're consistently working after hours when you don't want to, but your boss might not think it's a problem for you because you are responding back, right? And so we need to communicate our boundaries in order for us to be on the same page as to where you're at. Another thing to expect when you're establishing boundaries is that you can feel guilty or shameful for establishing these boundaries, right? Especially when it comes to these reactions that we might get from other people, right? If they're angry or if they're resistant towards us or if they're pushing back and telling us that we're wrong, we might feel shameful for that. Guilty, shameful, overwhelmed about setting these boundaries. But again, it's really important to remember the purpose of these boundaries, right? To help and protect your personal well-being while also healing or helping create healthier relationships, which you're going to hear me say a couple times in the next couple slides. So just remember that, right? The purpose of setting a boundary. The other thing to expect when establishing a boundary, like I discussed in the last slide, is reasserting your boundaries, right? Again, especially when it comes to setting a new boundary in an old relationship, you might have to reassert that boundary a few times in order for that person to learn and remember what your boundary is, right? So if we take that same example of the boss sending you work emails, you might have to remind that boss a few times, like, hey, just so you know, I'm not going to respond to that email until the morning. And they might tell you, oh, don't worry about it. I'm just sending the email so that I can get the information off my mind, but feel free to respond back to me in the morning. Or maybe they might say something like, oh, of course, I completely forgot. I'll try to remember that for next time. Right? Again, you might have to reassert that boundary a couple of times in order for that person to remember and learn what that boundary is if it wasn't a boundary that was established before in the relationship. Now, we talked a little bit about these expectations that come with establishing a boundary that might be negative, but there's also a lot of positive benefits to establishing a boundary within your relationships, right? It promotes autonomy, you're warding off burnout, you're improving your emotional health, you're improving your relationships, you're enriching and bettering your relationships because now you're creating clear expectations for others. You're benefiting your well-being by taking care of yourself because you're no longer ignoring your needs and your wants, right? You're now treating yourself as a priority the same way that you would treat others. You're safeguarding your physical space and your time, and you're helping to protect your own emotional feelings, right? You now gain respect from other people, and you're also gaining self-respect, right? You're taking care of yourself. And so these are the positive impacts of establishing boundaries, because again, the point is to try to create healthy relationships with other people while also kind of creating a healthier relationship with yourself, right? Again, the first most important point of establishing a boundary is to recognize that you deserve respect. And so that's part of the benefits of establishing and setting boundaries with other people. And so I want to talk briefly about cultural considerations, right? Because establishing boundaries can be difficult depending on what culture you come from. So individualistic cultures, they tend to promote the needs of the individual. So if you come from a place like the US, right, or Europe, or another type of culture that's more individualistic, it might be easier to establish boundaries. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be met with some type of criticism or with some type of anger, right, or pushback, but it might be easier um, to establish these boundaries within your family, with your friend group, with your bosses, because of the type of culture that individualistic societies tend to promote. Now, when it comes to collectivistic cultures, on the other hand, setting boundaries, even if you're doing it in a respectful or kind or loving way, can be perceived as disrespectful, as rude, as offensive. And the main reason is because of the core values that these types of cultures and families tend to promote. So, for example, collectivistic cultures tend to have like sacrifice and honor and loyalty as some of the core values within their society. And so it's understandable that people who come from collectivistic cultures tend to feel guilty or overwhelmed when trying to set boundaries, especially when their culture prioritizes family and the collective and community or the unit above all else, right? Another thing to kind of think about is how navigating boundaries can be even more challenging for children of immigrants who might struggle to understand social rules and expectations from the dominant culture. So for example, my family is from Mexico. So going from Mexico to the US, going from a collectivistic culture to an individualistic one can be really difficult, especially when your peers are able to establish boundaries with their family, again, with their friends. And those peers and the dominant culture as a whole is encouraging you to establish these boundaries with your family, right? Establish these boundaries when it comes to privacy or your physical or material belongings, things like that. But when you come home and you try to establish those boundaries, it can lead to tension within these families, right? And so I think what's really important is understanding that boundaries can look different from family to family, from friend group to friend group, from person to person, and it can be dependent on that culture, right? And understanding that people can struggle with establishing these boundaries, but what's most important, again, is to remember the purpose of these boundaries, right? Is to protect your personal well-being and to create healthier relationships with other people. So that's the bulk of my presentation. I just want to say thank you for allowing me to present on boundaries. And that is all.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation today on boundaries. And as usual, we'll have this loaded on the website. So if there's any follow-up or resources or any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And if not, we look forward to next month for our mental